Montana Highline 1917. The wind was a raw, physical force, howling like a tortured animal across the open prairie at a steady 50 miles per hour, slicing the air into razor blades. The temperature hovered at 35 degrees below zero, a deep, bone-aching cold that promised no reprieve. While homesteading neighbors cursed the frosted landscape and fought desperately to thaw the pipes of their flimsy, standard 12 by 6-foot claim shacks, Carl Peterson was engaged in a project they openly mocked as idiotic, meticulously constructing a tight, small log cabin entirely within the shell of an enormous, long-abandoned timber barn. They laughed openly at the German-Russian immigrant, labeling his work wasteful and overly complicated. "You're heating 2 roofs," they'd shout across the icy field, the scorn amplified by the wind. "You'll burn through your entire woodpile before Christmas." Carl spent 2 meticulous months on the foundation and structure, a task others had rushed through in a reckless 3 weeks. He positioned his modest 14 by 18-foot cabin exactly 8 feet away from the barn's exterior walls, intentionally creating a continuous, uninterrupted dead air buffer zone that completely encapsulated his living space. His patience was soon vindicated. The true Arctic blast arrived with lethal speed, a blizzard that hammered the Highline for 10 relentless days. Temperatures plummeted to 45 below zero, and the wind gusts routinely spiked past 60 miles per hour. Standard claim cabins, built for haste and optimism, failed catastrophically. Interior temperatures barely held at 5 degrees Fahrenheit, even with stoves stoked red-hot, consuming their precious fuel. But inside that foolish cabin within a barn, the air was a steady, almost tropical 38 degrees. That 33-degree thermal difference was not a matter of comfort. It was the precise difference between succumbing to freezing and the fundamental act of survival. What essential, practical wisdom regarding wind, insulation, and heat retention did this immigrant possess that every established Montanan pioneer seemed to have forgotten? If you value stories of enduring, practical wisdom that stands defiant against the passage of time and the forces of nature, make sure to subscribe. We have more documented accounts of forgotten frontier genius worth remembering. Carl Peterson had arrived in north-central Montana 3 months earlier, carrying a stout wagon full of specialized tools, a head crammed with hard-won memories, and just enough cash reserved to guarantee survival through exactly 1 winter, provided he managed his expenses with absolute discipline. The glossy railroad advertisements had seduced thousands with promises of mild, periodic Chinook winds and effortlessly fertile farming land. But the German-Russian immigrant knew better than to put faith in sales pitches crafted hundreds of miles away. He had been raised in a traditional house barn on the Russian steppe, a fortress-like structure where his grandmother, Anna Schmidt, had instilled in him the unbreakable rule of survival: always build for the worst winter you have ever witnessed, never for the best one you simply remember. The homestead claim he filed in May 1917 came with an unexpected, monumental advantage: a massive timber frame barn, roughly 40 feet wide by 70 feet long, left standing by a failed cattle outfit that had retreated years earlier. The enormous structure visually dominated the prairie landscape. It featured massive, hand-hewn posts and beams, connected with precise peg joints, and a heavy roof that had somehow endured 5 Montana winters without catastrophic collapse. The siding planks were rough-cut and showed visible gaps between them, and the interior reeked of generations of old hay, dust, and abandonment. Yet, its structural bones were undeniably solid. Most neighbors, seeing its condition, would have deemed it fit only for equipment storage or perhaps temporary livestock shelter. Carl, however, looked upon the imposing edifice and immediately recognized it as a ready-made fortress against the destructive prairie wind. By late August, while other homesteaders were frantically racing to hastily finish their minimum standard claim shacks before the first anticipated snow, Carl was laying out the blueprints for something entirely different. Inside the vast, dim space of the barn, he carefully measured the footprint for a 14 by 18-foot log cabin, deliberately positioning it 8 to 10 feet away from the barn's massive exterior walls. The exact placement was critical. He situated the cabin nearer to the leeward side, the side protected from the prevailing winter's northwest winds. This setup meant that the storm's initial force would strike the barn's back wall and then spill over the roof, creating a crucial pocket of relative, calmer air around his actual living quarters. The foundation was the first painstaking step. He set short, dense stone piers that rose 18 inches up from the barn's packed dirt floor, supporting a framework of salvaged planks that would form the cabin's subfloor. Beneath this raised platform, he stuffed every available inch of space with straw and sawdust, primitive, yet effective insulation materials that demanded nothing but back-breaking labor to gather and pack. The resulting crawl space looked crude to an outside eye, but Carl remembered exactly how his grandmother had painstakingly packed similar organic materials between the double walls of their step dwelling, effectively trapping still air that retained warmth throughout months of howling winds. The log work began in September. Each piece was carefully selected from a stand of resilient lodgepole pine he had specifically purchased from a homesteader desperate for cash. The logs measured 6 to 8 inches in diameter. They were not the massive, expensive timbers that signaled a wealthy man's structure, but they were substantial enough to hold their shape, settle correctly, and provide decent thermal mass for heat storage. Carl notched each log with the deliberate precision his own grandfather had taught him, fitting them so tightly that the barest sliver of daylight struggled to penetrate the joints. The essential chinking came next. Thin wood splinters were driven into every minor gap, then packed firm with a mix of moss, straw, and a lime sand mortar. This complex mixture utilized techniques he had internalized years earlier while watching specialized German-Russian masons constructing solid church foundations back in Kansas. The roof proved to be the most structurally complex element of the entire project. Carl framed it using 2x6 rafters salvaged meticulously from a partially collapsed shed nearby, creating a low-profile, heavy gable designed to shed accumulated snow efficiently. Over the rafters went board sheathing, then a critical layer of protective tar paper, and finally the durable cedar shingles he had acquired through a complicated trade with a neighbor who desperately needed fence posts cut and delivered. The finished roof sat a full 8 feet beneath the barn's existing rafters, leaving a substantial, deep airspace above the cabin. This massive air cushion ensured that any potential, crippling snow loads on the outer barn roof would never exert pressure on the inner structure. James Halverson, the established and influential rancher whose opinion carried significant weight throughout the county, made his first inspection visit in early October. He walked slowly around the construction site, shaking his head slowly in genuine bewilderment at the sheer illogic of what he saw. A cabin built inside a barn made absolutely no conceptual sense to a man who had successfully prospered for 20 years relying on open-range cattle and minimal, temporary winter shelter. "You're heating 2 roofs, Peterson," Halverson declared loudly, projecting his voice so the small, curious crowd of neighbors could clearly hear the professional condemnation. "That big shell will act like a gigantic icebox and suck every bit of warmth right out of your little cabin. You'll end up burning twice the wood and freezing twice as fast as the rest of us." Thomas McKay, who was rushing to finalize his own meager 12 by 14-foot claim shack just 2 miles to the east, enthusiastically joined in the chorus of criticism. His single-wall frame house, thinly covered with tar paper siding, perfectly represented the conventional wisdom of the Highline: build fast, build cheap, and rely on the optimistic belief that Montana winters were not truly as harsh as the perpetual pessimists claimed. Carl's building a Hoft hotel, McKay scoffed to his wife, Eliza, that very evening, watching the first, defiant column of smoke rise from his neighbor's colossal barn structure. "Mark my words, he'll be forced into town by January," begging the mercantile owner for a rented room above the store. But Carl continued his work, driven by a deep, generational knowledge that transcended local, modern convention. In the cool evenings, he would stand proudly inside his nearly completed cabin and patiently explain his principles to anyone willing to set aside their skepticism and listen. The barn, he insisted, was emphatically not a building to be heated. It was a primary windbreak made of enormous timbers, a giant, unheated buffer zone explicitly designed to absorb the full, destructive force of the prairie's storms while protecting the smaller, exceptionally tighter, and insulated structure nesting within. The vast layer of air trapped between the barn walls and the cabin walls, he explained, would act as primary insulation, precisely like the trapped-down feathers in his grandmother's thickest quilts held body heat through the long, unforgiving Russian winters. This technical explanation of thermal dynamics and air management fell mostly upon hardened, skeptical ears. Most homesteaders had learned their construction methods from other homesteaders, perpetuating a cycle of techniques that prioritized only speed and minimal financial investment over robust thermal performance. The idea that still, unheated air could possess insulating value equal to, or even greater than, thick logs challenged every accepted notion they held about frontier construction. When Carl demonstrated how he had carefully positioned the single stovepipe to pass through the inner roof, then transitioned to a larger, double-walled metal section before exiting through the barn's outer roof, they saw only unnecessary complexity and wasted materials, failing entirely to appreciate the critical fire safety engineering and the maximization of heat exchange. By November, as the first truly serious cold began to settle relentlessly across the Highline, the social pressure and ridicule intensified. Neighbors who had initially been merely curious now spoke openly about the fool's double house and began wagering cash among themselves on exactly how long the German-Russian would last before publicly admitting his monumental mistake. The cabin was finally finished. A steady, comforting column of smoke now rose from its chimney, and Carl's small family had moved in just as the first definitive blizzard warnings appeared in the local weekly newspaper. But the true, existential test was still approaching, and every resident of the prairie knew it was only a matter of time. The specific knowledge that guided Carl's radically unconventional design stretched back 3 generations to the perpetually windswept steppes of southern Russia, where his grandmother, Anna Schmidt, had learned from necessity to build structures that could reliably withstand months of bone-crushing, unyielding cold. In the established German-Russian settlements of Ukraine, survival depended entirely on the institution of house barns, massive, combined dwellings where multiple families and all their essential livestock, cows, pigs, horses, shared a single colossal roof. Their collective body heat and the strategic sharing of thick walls created localized, livable microclimates that fundamentally softened winter's relentless assault. Anna had supervised the complex construction of such essential buildings, mixing the binding clay, laying heavy sod, and raising massive timber frames that enclosed both the human quarters and the animal stalls within extraordinarily thick, wind-stopping walls. These walls were specifically designed to break the wind's velocity before it could steal precious internal heat. When Carl was a boy of 12, Anna had guided him carefully through their family house barn during a ferocious blizzard that completely buried the settlement for 6 agonizing days. She pointed to the double walls filled with insulating straw, the careful, strategic positioning of the living spaces away from the exterior shell, and the critical way animal heat would naturally rise through the structure to warm the sleeping loft where the children rested. "You never fight the wind," she had told him in German, her voice carrying the stark authority of someone who had survived 40 devastating Russian winters. "You make the wind fight something else first, then build your warm place safely behind that shield." Now, 15 years later and 2,000 miles west, Carl was applying those precise, ancient lessons to the unforgiving, treeless climate of Montana. The massive, hollow barn shell served exactly the same function as the outer, defensive walls of Anna's house barn. It was not a space to be warmed, but a formidable barrier that absorbed the prairie's fury long before it could ever reach the family's actual living quarters. Every morning, he would step from the inner cabin's warmth into the barn's dim, cavernous interior and feel the immediate, profound difference. Where the wind outside shrieked and howled at 50 mph, the air inside the barn moved only gently, softly buffered by 40 feet of timber and rough siding that methodically broke the storm's momentum into harmless, swirling eddies. The structure's air management system was deceptively simple, yet critically important. High up in the barn's large gables, Carl had deliberately left small, strategic ventilation gaps. This allowed the outer shell to constantly breathe, preventing dangerous moisture buildup that could inevitably lead to rot in the timber frame or create severe condensation problems during sudden temperature shifts. But crucially, the large volume of air trapped between the barn's interior walls and the cabin's exterior logs remained almost entirely still, contained within a buffer zone that fundamental physics would later recognize as an extraordinarily effective insulating medium. Dry, motionless air possesses remarkable thermal resistance properties, creating a profound resistance to heat transfer that can rival modern, manufactured insulation when properly contained within an enclosed cavity. The stove installation demanded particular care, as Carl was effectively creating a wood-burning system within two separate, layered structures. He positioned a medium-sized cast iron box stove, estimating its reliable output at roughly 30,000 British thermal units per hour, near the center of the cabin's main room. This output was perfectly sufficient to heat the cabin's 252 square feet without dangerously overwhelming the sealed space. The stovepipe rose straight through the inner cabin's roof, then transitioned into a larger diameter metal chimney section, designed for safety and heat dissipation, before exiting vertically through the barn's roof, maintaining proper, generous clearance from all combustible timbers while simultaneously ensuring adequate draw and draft. Neighbors, however, continued to question every complex aspect of the design. Niels Andersen, a Norwegian carpenter who had recently satisfied his own claim requirements, examined the complex flue arrangement with professional, critical skepticism. "That pipe arrangement looks like a fire trap just waiting to happen," he commented, though his tone carried more curiosity than outright condemnation. Unlike the established ranchers who simply dismissed Carl's methods out of hand, Andersen recognized deep-seated elements that reminded him of time-honored Scandinavian building traditions, the absolute emphasis on tight construction, the meticulous attention to air sealing, and the strategic, intentional use of buffer spaces to moderate extreme interior temperatures. The first serious, sustained test arrived in mid-November when ambient temperatures dropped suddenly to 20 degrees below zero and sustained winds whipped across the prairie at a steady 35 mph. Thomas Mackay, desperately burning fence posts and greenwood scraps simply to keep his claim shack above freezing, watched the smoke rise steadily from Carl's massive barn and wondered aloud to Eliza how much fuel that ridiculous double structure must be consuming. His own interior thermometer showed only 42 degrees at dawn despite running his stove hard all night, while the water left in his wash basin had frozen into a solid sheet by morning. Carl, meanwhile, was conducting his own measurements with the methodical, scientific precision his grandmother had drilled into him. Each morning, he meticulously recorded the outdoor temperature, the temperature inside the unheated barn, and the steady temperature inside the cabin, along with careful notes detailing wind conditions and exact fuel consumption. The results were immediate and revealing. While his cabin consistently maintained a steady 55 degrees with only moderate firing, the barn interior averaged 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outdoor air, effectively creating a crucial, stepped thermal gradient that drastically reduced heat loss from the much smaller inner structure. The fuel efficiency was equally impressive. Where Mackay was burning 3 to 4 armloads of wood per day just to maintain barely tolerable conditions, Carl's superior setup required only 2 precisely managed armloads to achieve significantly superior comfort. The dramatic difference lay not in the quality of the stove or the wood, but in the fundamental engineering approach to heat retention. Instead of trying to warm a structure that leaked heat through every wall and joint, Carl was warming a single, tight envelope, which was itself protected by an outer shell that absorbed the primary wind pressure and completely neutralized convective heat loss. James Halverson made a second inspection visit in late November, this time bringing several other prominent ranchers who were determined to see the contraption for themselves. Walking through the barn's massive main doors and then entering the snug, inner cabin felt like moving through successive, impenetrable layers of protection. Each threshold represented another barrier against the prairie's escalating assault. The inner cabin was undeniably warm, comfortable enough that the men could shed their heavy coats and sit working at a table without gloves, a luxury that few, if any, standard claim shacks could afford during Montana's deepening winter. Yet, Halverson remained stubbornly unconvinced, attributing the performance to temporary factors rather than sound design principles. "Wait until January," he predicted, his breath briefly visible in the barn's cooler air. "When the real cold hits, that big shell will turn into a giant icebox and suck every single degree out of your little cabin. You're just postponing the inevitable, Peterson." Carl accepted the criticism without argument, though privately he felt the profound confidence that came from successfully applying proven, ancient methods to challenging new circumstances. Anna Schmidt's lessons had thoroughly prepared him for exactly this kind of skepticism, the ingrained resistance that established communities always showed toward unfamiliar techniques, even when those techniques had already proven themselves across centuries of harsh climate survival. The memory of December 1899 still haunted Montana ranchers, having taught them with catastrophic brutality that the territory's climate could shift without warning from merely manageable to utterly lethal. The Great Die-Up Winter had killed entire herds of cattle and bankrupted established cattlemen who had foolishly trusted in mild seasons and open-range grazing. Now, 20 years later, the ominous signs were accumulating again. Early blizzards in November, unseasonably deep cold settling prematurely across the Highline, and old-timers in town speaking quietly about dropping barometric pressure and the nervous behavior of livestock, all suggesting that something far worse was building. By mid-December, the severe contrast between conventional construction and Carl's double-shell system had become undeniable to anyone paying even minimal attention. Thomas and Eliza McKay were burning through their carefully stockpiled firewood at a terrifying rate, stoking their single-wall claim shack every few hours just to maintain interior temperatures that hovered precariously in the high 30s. On rare, calm nights, they could manage a barely tolerable 55 degrees. But when the prairie winds surged back up to 35 or 40 mph, their interior thermometer dropped dangerously into the 20s despite a red-hot stove that consumed fence posts and salvaged furniture legs with desperate, fleeting efficiency. The McKays' horrifying experience was typical rather than exceptional. Across the scattered homesteads of north-central Montana, families living in standard construction were rapidly discovering that their hastily built cabins performed adequately only under the most ideal, windless conditions. Single-shell log and frame structures, with minimal chinking and thin tar paper siding, leaked precious heat through countless invisible gaps that instantly became focused wind channels during a storm. Even the marginally well-built claim shacks suffered from a fundamental, shared design flaw. They presented their main living spaces directly to the prairie's furious assault with no defensive buffer zone whatsoever to moderate the savage convective heat loss that occurred when moving air relentlessly stripped warmth from their exterior walls. Carl's setup was revealing its advantages through simple, observable physics that he understood intuitively but could never articulate in formal technical language. Each morning, his routine measurements consistently showed his inner cabin maintaining 50 to 55 degrees with fuel consumption that had stabilized at roughly two-thirds of what his suffering neighbors required. The barn shell was performing exactly as Anna Schmidt's house barn principles had predicted, absorbing the full wind pressure before it could drive debilitating cold air infiltration into the family's actual living space. Crucially, the 8-foot-wide cavity of mostly still, trapped air between the barn walls and the cabin walls provided an insulating value that traditional frontier construction simply could not match. The dead air principle was ancient, time-tested knowledge that most frontier builders had largely forgotten in their frantic rush to meet the minimal, arbitrary homestead requirements. Trapped air, when effectively prevented from circulating and carrying heat away, resisted thermal transfer with remarkable efficiency. Modern building science would later rigorously quantify this exact principle. Phenomenon, demonstrating that the simple principle of enclosed airspaces could yield thermal resistance values strikingly comparable to those provided by even the most sophisticated manufactured insulation available at the time. Carl's grandmother, A woman whose knowledge was etched by decades of harsh prairie winters rather than codified scientific texts, had intuitively grasped this fundamental relationship. She had observed that thick double walls, especially when packed with insulating materials like straw and thoroughly protected from the ravages of air movement, consistently provided significantly greater warmth to families than single walls of equal structural depth. The critical windbreak effect, a concept equally dismissed and misunderstood by Karl's most vocal critics, proved to be just as decisive. Subsequent research, the kind that would not be formally undertaken or proven for another half-century, would categorically demonstrate that structures shielded by effective wind barriers consumed a staggering 20 to 40% less heating fuel than identical buildings exposed mercilessly to the prevailing winds. The barn shell, in effect, was functioning as a colossal, multi-story wooden shelter belt, deliberately constructed directly around the essential living space. This ingenious arrangement created a predictable and stable microclimate where external wind speeds plummeted dramatically, and the catastrophic heat loss typically caused by uncontrolled air infiltration was mitigated and reduced by as much as 75%. James Halvorson, a man whose territorial pride hinged on tradition, remained stubbornly skeptical, even as irrefutable evidence accumulated region-wide that conventional building wisdom was failing against the deepening cold. His own ranch buildings, massive, sturdy frame structures built precisely according to the rigid, established territorial practices, were visibly struggling to cope with the prolonged period of Arctic temperatures. Ice formed thick and regularly on interior walls, transforming sleeping quarters into frigid bunkers. His hired men were now openly complaining about the bunkhouses, which demanded constant, aggressive stoking of the stoves merely to remain minimally habitable. When Halvorson finally condescended to visit Karl's unusual setup in late December, the contrast between the two operations was immediate and profound, yet utterly inexplicable within the confined framework of his own understanding. "He must be using better wood," Halvorson muttered stubbornly, completely unwilling to entertain the possibility that the structural design itself might be fundamentally superior to the decades-old methods that had admittedly worked adequately during milder seasons. Yet, other neighbors were beginning to ask far more pointed questions, their skepticism tempered by mounting practical evidence. Neil Anderson, whose professional carpentry experience gave him an innate appreciation for meticulous, tight construction, examined the baffling thermal performance with growing, professional interest. He had carefully noted that his own family's cabin, though built with painstaking attention to log fitting and precise chinking, had already consumed nearly 3 full cords of firewood by Christmas Day. In stark contrast, Karl's mysterious double structure had burned less than 2 cords, all while providing an apparently superior level of interior comfort. This remarkable fuel efficiency strongly suggested principles that Anderson immediately recognized from ancestral Norwegian building traditions, where the strategic use of protective buffer zones and sophisticated air management systems had organically evolved over centuries of surviving truly harsh, unforgiving climates. The social dynamics of the community were perceptibly shifting as the winter deepened and relentless reality began contradicting all their confident predictions. Men who had only weeks earlier openly mocked Karl's Hoft Hotel now visited frequently, carrying measuring sticks and disguising pointed, practical questions as mere casual conversation. They desperately wanted to understand the precise spacing between the inner and outer walls, the exact configuration of the ventilation system that somehow prevented catastrophic moisture problems in the barn shell, and the critical details of the stove installation that managed to efficiently heat both structures without the excessive fuel consumption they had all predicted. Karl received these delicate inquiries with quiet, consistent patience, explaining his innovative methods without a trace of defensiveness or intellectual superiority. He systematically showed visitors how the massive barn doors created an essential airlock effect, how the inner cabin's exceptionally tight construction concentrated and maximized heating efficiency, and how the dead air buffer zone critically moderated the wild temperature swings that routinely made other, single-shell dwellings uncomfortable, even when they were adequately warmed. His meticulous pencil-marked record board provided undeniable, documentary proof of the structure's performance, with hard measurements that spoke volumes louder than any theoretical argument. Consistent interior temperatures, predictable and frugal fuel consumption rates, and a level of thermal comfort his neighbors were achieving only during the briefest, mildest weather windows. But the true ultimate test was still looming large on the horizon. Persistent weather patterns strongly suggested that January was poised to deliver the kind of sustained Arctic outbreak that irrevocably separated adequate frontier construction from genuinely life-saving design. Barometric readings were dropping steadily and ominously. Livestock across the plains were exhibiting a profound restlessness that the old-timers invariably associated with the imminent arrival of severe storms. Moreover, the distinctive quality of the light cast on the northern horizon hinted unmistakably at the massive, stable high-pressure system that would soon dominate the entire Central Plains. When that colossal system finally arrived, the performance differences between conventional single-shell construction and Karl's audacious double-envelope experiment would cease being matters of mere comfort. They would become stark questions of immediate survival. And the community's prior mockery would swiftly give way to desperate, focused interest in any methods that might mean the stark difference between freezing to death and staying alive. The storm that would ultimately define the infamous winter of 1917 arrived abruptly on January 15th, without the slow, gradual buildup that usually provided experienced plainsmen with adequate warning. The barometric pressure dropped precipitously and violently overnight, and by the faint light of dawn, the wind was already gusting above 50 miles per hour across the utterly frozen ground, which offered no resistance whatsoever to the dense Arctic air mass sweeping down unimpeded from Canada. Within 6 agonizing hours, the ambient temperature had plunged from a difficult but manageable 10 degrees below zero to a lethal 35 degrees below, and snow was falling horizontally in thick, impenetrable sheets that reduced visibility to a harrowing few yards. Thomas Mackay was among the first to discover the fatal inadequacy of his flimsy claim shack, and this realization came even before the storm reached its full, terrifying intensity. By noon, with the wind aggressively hammering his single-wall frame construction at sustained speeds above 40 miles per hour, his interior thermometer stubbornly showed only 28 degrees Fahrenheit, despite a small stove that was glowing a painful, desperate red-hot and consuming every burnable scrap of fuel he could locate. The essential tar paper siding flapped violently, then tore in several critical places, allowing fine, powdery snow to sift relentlessly through the gaps in the board and batten walls that had seemed perfectly adequate and tight during milder weather. Eliza, terrified, wrapped their 2 young children in every blanket they owned and relocated them to the floor directly beside the stove. But even in that supposed sanctuary, the cold was rapidly transitioning into a life-threatening danger. Across the scattered homesteads, horrifyingly similar scenes were unfolding as basic frontier construction met environmental forces it had never been designed or intended to withstand. The Anderson family's carefully chinked log cabin quickly developed a heavy coating of interior frost, a crystalline layer that ominously spread outward from the walls toward the very center of the room, while their water bucket froze solid despite sitting a mere 3 feet from a roaring, frantic fire. The Halverson Ranch buildings, though significantly larger and seemingly more substantial than typical claim shacks, suffered from the exact same fundamental weakness. They presented their precious interior spaces directly and fully to the brutal wind. This relentless wind drove cold air through countless minuscule openings and stripped heat from the exterior surfaces faster than any conceivable or reasonable amount of fuel could possibly replace it. Yet, inside Karl's massive barn, the complex physics of wind pressure and heat transfer were playing out precisely according to the principles that Anna Schmidt had understood through hard, lived experience rather than abstract scientific theory. The massive timber frame of the barn absorbed the storm's initial, ferocious assault, successfully dissipating the main wind pressure across 40 feet of weathered siding before any moving air could even remotely reach the inner cabin's walls. Snow quickly accumulated in 8-foot drifts against the barn's windward side, but this vast natural insulation only improved the structure's overall performance by adding immense thermal mass that effectively moderated internal heat loss. The crucial dead air buffer zone was performing exactly as intended. In the space between the barn's interior walls and the cabin's exterior logs, the air remained largely motionless despite the unimaginable chaos raging outside, creating an unparalleled insulating barrier that prevented convective heat loss while consistently maintaining internal temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the savage outdoor conditions. Carl's morning thermometer reading inside the cabin showed a stable 41 degrees Fahrenheit. This was certainly cold by modern standards, but it was absolutely survivable with appropriate clothing and bedding, and, critically, it was dramatically warmer than the sub-freezing. Lethal conditions that were utterly overwhelming his neighbors' desperate heating systems. The fuel efficiency advantage had now become, quite literally, a matter of life and death. While exposed families in single-shell cabins were being forced to burn precious furniture, fence posts, and even grain wood in desperate, futile attempts to maintain barely tolerable temperatures, Carl's superior setup continued to provide adequate warmth with entirely sustainable fuel consumption. His carefully stacked cordwood, which had seemed excessively prudent to observers who favored minimal preparation, was lasting precisely as long as his grandmother's profound experience had taught him to expect. By the third relentless day of the storm, with outdoor temperatures locked steadily at 45 degrees below zero and wind speeds consistently roaring above 50 miles per hour, the first desperate neighbors began arriving at Carl's barn. Thomas McKay appeared just after dawn, laboring through waist-deep snow, carrying his youngest child and assisting Eliza. Their claim shack had become utterly uninhabitable during the night when interior temperatures finally plummeted below 10 degrees, and their remaining fuel reserves ran out completely. McKay's once stubborn pride had finally yielded to the undeniable, terrifying reality that his family would not survive another night in conventional construction. The barn doors, which had been previously dismissed by earlier visitors as an unnecessary complexity, now revealed their vital function as an essential airlock system. McKay pushed through the first set of heavy doors into the relative calm of the barn's interior, where the wind speeds instantly dropped to gentle currents, and the temperature immediately felt 20 degrees warmer than the killing cold outside. The second threshold, leading into Carl's inner cabin, brought them into a space that felt almost tropical by comparison. It was warm enough to shed heavy outer coats, warm enough to speak without seeing visible plumes of breath, warm enough simply to function again as human beings rather than as panicked survival machines focused solely on avoiding immediate hypothermia. Over the following 2 days, 3 additional families desperately sought shelter in what locals were rapidly beginning to call the Barn Fortress. The inner cabin comfortably accommodated Carl's family plus one other, while the barn's spacious loft was hastily furnished with blankets and tarps to shelter the additional refugees. The temperature differential was now measurable in stark, life-saving terms: 45 degrees below zero outside, 5 to 10 degrees inside the most exposed claim shacks, and a stable 38 to 42 degrees in Carl's protected inner cabin. The 35-degree advantage that skeptics had so easily dismissed as structurally impossible was now actively keeping 12 people alive, while conventional construction utterly failed around them. James Halverson finally arrived on the storm's 6th day. His deep-seated confidence in established methods was finally, irrevocably broken by the chilling sight of his own bunkhouse windows frosted over completely on the inside despite constant, aggressive firing. He found families working calmly by lamplight in Carl's cabin, children playing quiet games instead of miserably huddling for warmth, and adults able to cook warm meals and maintain surprisingly normal household routines. The contrast with his own sprawling ranch, where his hired men were reduced to burning expensive furniture just to avoid freezing, provided undeniable, brutal evidence that everything he thought he knew about cold climate construction was dangerously, fatally inadequate. The storm finally broke on January 25th, leaving behind a scarred landscape dramatically transformed by wind-sculpted snow and scattered, pervasive evidence of structural failure. Several claim shacks had partially collapsed under overwhelming snow loads or direct wind pressure, while others, though structurally intact, had proven utterly uninhabitable during the worst of the weather siege. Carl's barn showed no structural damage beyond cosmetic wear, and his inner cabin had maintained life-sustaining temperatures throughout the 10-day ordeal without depleting his vital fuel reserves or requiring the desperate, dangerous measures that had characterized survival efforts elsewhere. When the rescued families finally returned home to assess their own damaged dwellings, the tenor of community conversation had permanently shifted from open mockery to genuinely respectful inquiry about methods that had decisively proven themselves under conditions that conventional wisdom simply could not survive. When the families finally emerged from Carl's barn fortress on January 26th, they stepped into a stark, silent landscape brutally sculpted by 10 days of unrelenting wind. Snow drifts reached the very eaves of the barn's leeward side, while the windward face showed the polished, wind-scoured surface that definitively marked structures that had absorbed the storm's full, concentrated fury without yielding. Across the scattered homesteads, the evidence of comprehensive structural failure was unmistakable. The Anderson cabin's roof visibly sagged under accumulated snow loads. The McKay claim shack listed noticeably where sustained wind pressure had dangerously loosened its foundation, and 2 abandoned dugouts had collapsed entirely where their sod roofs could no longer bear the immense weight of wind-packed snow. The serious conversations that ensued carried none of the scornful mockery that had characterized earlier discussions of Carl's eccentric methods. James Halverson, whose substantial ranch buildings had suffered frozen pipes and extensive interior frost damage despite their costly construction, approached Carl with the measured respect of a man whose core assumptions had been thoroughly defeated by reality. "That airspace between your cabin and the barn wall," he began, his voice laced with genuine curiosity rather than habitual skepticism. "How did you figure the right distance? Too close and it wouldn't work. Too far, and you'd completely lose the benefit." Carl patiently walked the humbled rancher around the perimeter, stick in hand, explaining the empirical principles that Anna Schmidt had taught him, all without claiming superior wisdom or highlighting his neighbor's grave mistakes. The critical key, he explained, was maintaining at least a 6 to 8 foot buffer zone, enough space to ensure that the air could not circulate freely between the inner and outer walls, yet not so much distance that the outer shell failed to provide its essential wind protection. The barn structure itself needed to breathe at the top to prevent damaging moisture problems, but the vital cavity between the inner cabin and the barn walls had to remain as still and stagnant as possible to maximize its indispensable insulating value. Thomas McKay, whose entire family had survived the storm only because of Carl's unexpected hospitality, asked far more pointed questions about fundamental construction techniques. His own claim shack would require complete rebuilding before the following winter arrived, and he was absolutely determined to avoid repeating the design flaws that had so nearly cost his children their lives. Could you do this with a granary instead of a barn? He wondered aloud, picturing the smaller, more robust outbuilding that had weathered the storm far better than his main cabin. Set a tight little house inside a grain shed? The answer, Carl confirmed, was a resounding yes, provided the outer structure was inherently sound enough to serve as an effective windbreak and sufficiently large enough to successfully create meaningful, functional buffer zones. Carl swiftly sketched the essential requirements in the snow: an outer shell strategically positioned to absorb the brunt of the prevailing winds, an inner dwelling set back definitively from all exterior walls, controlled ventilation to prevent inevitable condensation problems, and careful attention paid to the stove installation to ensure both fire safety and maximum heating efficiency. The specific materials used mattered significantly less than a profound understanding of the physics governing wind protection and the dead air insulation system that made the whole concept function. Neil Anderson, whose robust carpentry background helped him rapidly grasp the technical principles, was already actively planning adaptations that would successfully combine Carl's proven buffer zone concept with traditional Scandinavian building techniques. Within a month, he had begun constructing a snug, tight-frame cottage inside his failing granary. strategically packing straw between the inner and outer walls and adding meticulously controlled vents based on his deep experience with Norwegian double-wall construction. This hybrid approach, old-world craftsmanship intelligently applied to Carl's barn shell innovation, represented exactly the kind of practical, necessary evolution that occurs when profoundly proven techniques intersect successfully with urgent local needs. By early spring, 3 other homesteaders had successfully built their own versions of the cabin-within-a-building design, flexibly adapting the core concept to fit their available structures and limited resources. One family utilized an abandoned store building, expertly creating a cozy 2-room dwelling within the commercial shell. Another built a crude but highly effective lean-to addition completely around their existing claim shack, creating a continuous buffer zone that instantly improved heating efficiency by an estimated 40%. These varied adaptations represented the organic, unstoppable spread of innovation that profoundly characterized frontier problem-solving, not rigid adherence to a single, prescribed design, but the flexible, intelligent application of sound physical principles to diverse, challenging circumstances. The validation of Carl's structure extended far beyond his immediate neighbors, reaching county officials and territorial building inspectors who had initially questioned whether Carl's double structure even met minimum homestead requirements. The structure's undeniable performance during the catastrophic January storm had demonstrated that his innovation profoundly exceeded, rather than merely circumvented, the law's protective intentions. Where minimum construction standards aimed simply to ensure basic habitability, Carl's refined methods had achieved superior habitability with comparable material costs and labor investment. The Territorial Agricultural Extension Service began the quiet process of documenting the design for formal inclusion in essential building guides intended for all new settlers arriving in the region. Margaret Lewis, the insightful county school teacher who would later compile invaluable oral histories of early homestead experiences, made her first recording visit to Carl's barn in April 1918. Her detailed notes described the inner cabin as remarkably comfortable and surprisingly well-appointed, while specifically emphasizing the practical simplicity and elegance of the overall system. She meticulously measured the critical dimensions, the 40x 70-foot barn shell, the 14 by 8-foot inner cabin, the 8 to 10-foot buffer zones, and interviewed the grateful neighbors about their harrowing winter experiences. Her records would eventually become an important part of the Montana Historical Society's documentation of essential ethnic building traditions that had enabled settlers to successfully survive the territory's uniquely harsh climate. The broader, more profound implications of Carl's unexpected success reached far beyond individual survival stories, touching on critical questions of building science that would not be formally studied or understood for several more decades. Modern research would eventually prove, definitively, that wind-protected structures could reduce heating energy consumption by 20 to 40%, while properly designed airspaces could achieve thermal resistance values approaching that of commercially manufactured insulation. The German-Russian immigrant who had never heard sophisticated terms like thermal envelope or convective heat transfer had nonetheless applied these very principles with intuitive precision, grounded entirely in generations of accumulated cold climate building experience. By 1920, when homestead filings in north-central Montana reached their historical peak, Carl's innovative barn within a barn had become a documented, published example in county extension bulletins that specifically advised new settlers on effective cold climate construction. The design. These successful structural concepts were ultimately integrated into formalized, regional advisories, appearing right alongside specifications for the humble yet highly effective sod houses and dugouts, shelter methodologies that completely rejected the prevailing aesthetics of conventional architecture. The recommendations focused strictly on earth-sheltered and other building types that prioritized robust thermal performance and enduring structural integrity over superficial, high-status appearance. This shift represented a crucial acknowledgement that crude, earthbound structures were superior insulators compared to the flimsy, rapidly built frame homes imported from milder climates. What had begun years earlier as the astute, localized adaptation, the implementation of hard-won, Old World agrarian knowledge applied directly to the unforgiving realities of the American frontier had long since ceased to be an isolated experiment. It matured, through practical validation under extreme duress, into the undisputed, recognized standard of best practice across the desolate High Plains. This was a region where mere winter survival hinged directly on a rigorous, almost scientific understanding of the critical synergy between superior wind insulation and optimal, conservative fuel efficiency. A relationship that ensured a family's survival by drastically reducing their reliance on impossibly scarce wood or prohibitively expensive coal. The standardized, high-volume construction techniques promoted by the establishment, the so-called mainstream building methods, were built for appearance or speed, and tragically too often ignored this fundamental, life-saving relationship.